Спасибо.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I start my statement, once again, I'd like to underscore our fundamental disagreement with the excessive number of delegations under Rule 37 and Rule 39 of today's meeting. We believe that the optimal thing would have been to allow two, the EU and Ukraine. That was wisely done by the Chinese presidency in November, with the understanding that all others who wanted to could send their statement in writing. The other three delegations are in NATO and the EU, and so they agree on the general approach on Ukraine. It's quite clear that there is no added value from their statements, and that was indeed, or there will be no added value, and that was the same in the past. Each time the Security Council has to waste its time listening to a copy and paste of the EU statements, and they have to read them out in front of the camera. This undermines the prestige and authority of the Security Council, Mr. President. Distinguished colleagues, we have just heard from the report of Miroslav Yencha and Mr. Rajsingham, from which it is clear that nothing extraordinary occurred that required a UN Security Council open debate on Ukraine. Previously, as an excuse for such meetings, there would at least have been an albeit unsubstantiated tragedy imputed to the Russian armed forces in Ukrainian residential areas, something which, as became apparent later, in actual fact was the result of Ukrainian missile defense system located near civilian objects in violation of IHL, or there would have been hits on blacked-out supermarkets or grain stores or other port facilities by the Ukrainians, or areas where soldiers were deployed or where foreign mercenaries were living in hostels. Of course, then after that, there were always pictures of the ammunition published by the Ukrainians in the media, but they said that they had been destroyed. Today, a similar, even basic excuse is something that our Western colleagues rather haven't even found. But nonetheless, they've gone on with their ploy to keep the topic of Ukraine afloat, so to speak, in the UN Security Council. And because they from time to time have to meet in this chamber, even if it's cynical, because of the fact that these very countries are stubbornly not seeing the unfolding real humanitarian disaster caused by the conduct of Israel in the Gaza Strip. Over the past 2 months, according to the UN Secretary General, more children have died than in any conflict since he took up his post. Gaza is a place that he called a children's graveyard. However, this, according to the warped logic of Western countries, is not a reason for discussing that issue in the UN Security Council, because such a topic doesn't suit their geopolitical plan and presents their strategic ally in a poor light. Therefore, they prefer to meet in the Security Council on Ukraine to spew anti-Russian invective, or on Syria to trot out anti-Syrian narratives, and that is the case during the absolutely pointless regular Security Council meetings on Syrian chemical weapons. The US and their allies couldn't care less about the Ukrainians in actual fact. That was clear in April last year when the former British PM Boris Johnson, the head of the American Pentagon Lloyd Austin, managed to dissuade the head of the Kiev regime to sign an already initial draft peace agreement with Russia. Today in Kiev, they are biting their nails. They understand that such beneficial conditions for peace will never be again in Ukraine. Many are openly admitting what is clear. In order to avoid the impending crash, all the Kiev regime needed to do was to comply with the Minsk agreements, so to conduct itself vis-à-vis its own citizens like any normal, allegedly democratic state, and specifically to stop shelling them and killing them, and to give them the same rights to national, cultural, and historic self-identification as other inhabitants of Ukraine. However, such a scenario, as we know today from numerous sources, didn't suit the Western backers of the Zelensky regime, who for 10 years had backed the anti-constitutional coup in Maidan. As recognized by the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel and the former French President Hollande, they didn't arm Ukraine and prepare it for war with Russia under the cover of the Minsk agreements for 7 years, just like that, to enable two brotherly countries to live together in peace and agreement. Now, we're talking about colonial machinations here. Our African and Asian colleagues perfectly remember how their former European colonial masters for decades divvied up neighboring countries and carved them up with artificial borders, chopping up people groups into two, fueling wars and conflicts. Nothing in their conduct for those years has really changed, neither in Africa nor in Ukraine. And for many years, they prepared Ukraine to play the role of pawn in its geopolitical game against Russia. If we don't lose sight of this obvious geopolitical context, then there's no question as to why Boris Johnson, according to a recent witness of Zelensky's henchmen, dissuaded the head of the Kiev junta from concluding an agreement with Russia, using the words, "Let us just fight." The main EU diplomat, Mr. Borrell, from his self-proclaimed blossoming garden, that person who himself thought up the excellent idea of allocating money to war from the European Peace Fund, also in April last year said, and I quote, that this war needs to be played out on the battlefield, end quote. Ukraine decided to fight and pushed forward nonsensical Western slogans about the need to have a strategic defeat of Russia. And they fought so well that they've actually finished all of their soldiers that the Zelensky regime is callously throwing into the cannon fodder machine. In Ukrainian society, mobilization is now called mobilization, in other words, conscription to the grave. And nobody wants to go to a sure and pointless death. And that is proven by the fact that the mobilization age has now been increased to 50. Just a few days ago, as the Ukrainian media said, in the reservist training center, there was the training of the first group of 17-year-old orphans being trained. Now, they were supposed to be used purely in rear regions in Kharkov, namely the 103 Brigade of the Territorial Defense. However, the Ukrainian authorities deceived everybody as usual. And on the 3rd of December, one of the orphans died on the front line, and this was reported in social media by the director of the children's home. In a word, Zelensky and his lapdogs are developing a kind of Hitler Youth, just like the head of the Third Reich did before his inevitable ghastly end in May 1945. It's noteworthy that the death throes of the Kiev regime and its Führer have become so obvious that their henchmen are running around in circles. They're trying to get away from their leader. Over the past couple of weeks, according to the media, we hear that people are saying that Ukraine has a robust dictatorship. There's rampant corruption. There are fatal military calculations, and things are just not going where they want them to be going. We've talked about this in Security Council meetings for a long time now. However, now such statements are being made by people within Ukraine. For example, Arhamia, the former advisor of Zelensky, Arestovich as well, or the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko. There is also criticism regarding the clique of Zelensky and their desire to destroy Ukrainian orthodoxy in Ukraine. It is curious as to when our Western colleagues will recognize this. They are still continuing to pump taxpayers' money into a terribly corrupt, criminal Kiev regime. Now, I think some people have cut through this, but we've not seen that become a trend yet. Therefore, we have proposed discussing the impact of the ongoing supplies of Western weapons to Ukraine and the impact on the prospects for peace in Ukraine at a separate Security Council meeting on the 11th of December. Given the fact that over these days it's the 10th anniversary of the protests in Kiev Maidan, after which Ukraine and its US and backers and allies opted for a fatal path that was not in line with its national interest. Because of this, on the 8th of December, we are going to have an informal Area Formula meeting with involvement of some of the participants of those tragic events. Colleagues, in conclusion, since a number of Western delegations touched on this topic today and also in previous meetings, namely the so-called grain deal, and even accused Russia of actually provoking a famine in Ukraine, I'd like to point out the following. If the Ukrainians really were in such a ghastly situation as our Western colleagues are trying to say, then Kiev, I would have thought, wouldn't be able to export grain to countries in such enormous quantities. According to expert reports in 2022-2023 from the so-called starving Ukraine, more than 50 million tons of grain were exported. From January to August this year, food was sold to the tune of $14.6 billion, and this is grain crops, in particular wheat and corn. So I just want to ask, how does this trend line up with what our Western colleagues are talking about, the new Holodomor in the country? It seems that if that is the case, then you are the ones who are facilitating this Holodomor, because Kiev it has all this grain and it's surrounded by these very wealthy EU countries. However, there are the truckers in Eastern European countries who are blocking the borders and apparently preventing food going to this so-called starving country. Now, as regards prospects for resuming the Black Sea Grain Initiative, we have stated clearly we were deceived by the Kiev regime and also by Western countries who were talking about the humanitarian corridors. They did not comply with the Russia-UN memorandum. And until that is the case, until we get a guarantee that the Zelensky regime will properly comply with the initiative, then we cannot talk about resuming that initiative. Thank you.